Lucas Kane had always been a man of precision. His schedule was airtight, his image immaculate, and his control over his life absolute. Nothing was ever left to chance, not his billion-dollar empire, not his investments, and certainly not his personal affairs. That night at Le Jardin, a Michelin-starred restaurant where tables were booked months in advance, was supposed to be just another flawless evening in his carefully curated life. His girlfriend, Sophia Reed, was the kind of woman men envied him for. Young, breathtakingly beautiful, and poised, she had the perfect blend of elegance and ambition. She was an up-and-coming fashion designer, her name already buzzing in elite social circles, and being with Lucas had only added to her growing reputation. Tonight was a celebration, of her latest deal, of their relationship, of their power as a couple. Lucas arrived in a custom-tailored suit, his presence commanding attention the moment he stepped inside. Heads turned. He was used to that. He exuded wealth, power, and status, and people gravitated toward it, whether they admitted it or not. But none of that mattered tonight. Tonight, he was here for Sophia. Or at least, that's what he thought. They were escorted to a candlelit table by the window, overlooking the city skyline. Sophia was radiant, her red dress perfectly hugging her frame, her manicured fingers brushing against his as she leaned in. "Tonight is perfect," she whispered, smiling at him in a way that suggested how the evening might end. Lucas smirked, lifting his glass. "To perfection," he said smoothly, clinking his wine against hers. But just as he took a sip, his eyes wandered past Sophia, scanning the room out of habit. And then, everything stopped. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. Maybe the dim lighting or the wine had conjured up a ghost. But no. She was real. Emily. His ex-wife sat just a few tables away, her back straight, her posture effortlessly graceful as always. Time had done nothing to dull the sharp impact of her presence. She looked as stunning as ever, hair in soft waves, wearing an understated yet expensive dress. But it wasn't her appearance that froze the air in Lucas's lungs. It was the fact that she was pregnant. Very pregnant. The swell of her stomach was undeniable, and Lucas felt an unfamiliar sensation claw at his chest. It was as if the very foundation of his world had tilted without warning. Emily had moved on. She had a new life. And he had no part in it. Sophia noticed his distraction almost immediately. "Lucas?" she asked, following his gaze. "Do you know her?" Lucas hesitated. His grip tightened around his glass. Lying was pointless, Sophia was too sharp for that. "That's Emily," he admitted. "My ex-wife." Sophia's perfectly arched eyebrows lifted in interest. "Oh," she mused, clearly intrigued. "She's pregnant." Lucas nodded, but he couldn't speak. His mind was racing, calculating. Emily had walked away from their marriage 3 years ago. 3 years. Which meant, no. It wasn't possible. Was it? The thought made his stomach twist. Had Emily been carrying his child all this time without telling him? His pulse hammered in his ears as he watched her, oblivious to him, conversing with a man at her table. Lucas didn't recognize him, but something about the man's relaxed posture and familiarity with Emily made his blood run cold. Who was he? He had to stop staring. But he couldn't. Then, Emily looked up. For a split second, their eyes met. And in that moment, Lucas felt as if he had been thrown back in time, back to the days when they were inseparable, when she was the only person in the world who truly saw him, not as a billionaire, not as a business mogul, but as Lucas, the man. Her expression was unreadable at first. Then, something flickered in her gaze, not surprise, not discomfort, but something else entirely. A smirk. Lucas's breath hitched. That smirk, it wasn't casual, nor was it accidental. It was deliberate. As if she knew exactly what she was doing. As if she had been waiting for him to see her like this. The realization sent a surge of conflicting emotions through him. Emily had always been composed, always knew how to handle herself. But this? This was calculated. Sophia cleared her throat, irritation creeping into her voice. "Lucas, you're staring." He snapped back to reality. "Sorry," he muttered, forcing himself to focus on Sophia. He lifted his glass to take another sip, but the taste of the wine had turned bitter in his mouth. Sophia crossed her arms, tilting her head. "You're acting weird. Do you want to go over and say hello?" The suggestion made his skin prickle. Did he? Did he want to talk to Emily? Did he even have a right to? But before he could respond, the decision was made for him. Emily was standing up. Lucas's grip on his glass tightened as she walked across the restaurant, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She moved with the same confidence she always had, but there was an undeniable air of purpose in every step. Within seconds, she was at his table. "Lucas," she greeted, her voice smooth, almost amused. He forced himself to remain composed. "Emily." For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then Emily's eyes flickered toward Sophia, who was now observing the interaction with undisguised curiosity. Emily's lips curved into that knowing smile again. "I see you've moved on." Lucas exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "So have you." Emily glanced down at her stomach, resting a hand over it as if the gesture itself confirmed her reality. Then, looking back at him, she said something that made the entire restaurant fade into the background. "Have I?" Lucas blinked. The air around him suddenly felt too thick. What the hell did that mean? Before he could ask, Emily reached into her purse, pulled out a small envelope, and placed it on the table in front of him. "You're going to want to read this," she said, her voice softer now. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving him paralyzed in place. Sophia's eyes were wide with intrigue. Well, that was dramatic. Lucas didn't respond. His focus was entirely on the envelope. His name was written on it, in Emily's handwriting. A rush of emotions swirled inside him. Anger. Curiosity. Dread. He hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he picked up the envelope and carefully opened it. The moment he saw what was inside, his entire world shattered. His fingers trembled slightly as he pulled out the single sheet of paper, a DNA test result. And at the bottom, in bold, undeniable letters, was the truth that changed everything. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Lucas's breath left his body. His hands clenched. He felt Sophia's gaze on him, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders. Emily's smirk. The calculated way she had presented herself. The fact that she wanted him to see. Everything made sense now. The baby was his, and she had kept it from him. The revelation sent a shockwave through his entire being. And as he looked back toward Emily's table, she was already sitting down, resuming her conversation with the mystery man, as if she hadn't just upended his entire existence. Lucas Kane, the man who had always been in control, had just realized that for the first time in his life, he had absolutely none. And that was just the beginning. Lucas Kane sat frozen, staring at the DNA test in his trembling hands. The air in Le Jardin felt suffocating now, the dim lighting no longer romantic but oppressive. The elegant chatter of the wealthy patrons around him became a meaningless hum, fading into the background as his mind tried to process the undeniable truth in front of him. He was the father. The probability of paternity, 99.9%. A storm of emotions churned inside him, rage, disbelief, betrayal, confusion. Emily had been carrying his child all this time and hadn't told him? Why? How could she have kept something this monumental from him? And worse, why now? Why tonight, of all nights? He clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the paper, almost crumpling it. Across from him, Sophia leaned in, her sharp eyes darting between his face and the document. "Lucas," she said slowly, a mix of curiosity and suspicion in her voice. "What is that?" He barely heard her. His gaze snapped up, finding Emily effortlessly engaged in conversation with the man sitting beside her. The stranger had a confident but relaxed air, as if he belonged there, as if he belonged with Emily. Was he the reason she had disappeared for so long? Was he the reason Lucas hadn't known? Lucas's blood boiled at the thought. Sophia, clearly impatient, reached forward and plucked the document from his hands. He didn't stop her. He didn't even blink. He was too busy calculating his next move. Sophia's perfectly manicured fingers smoothed out the paper as she read, her lips parting slightly as realization dawned. She sucked in a slow breath, then lifted her gaze to Lucas, her expression shifting into something unreadable. "Well," she murmured, a small smirk playing at the corner of her lips. "That's interesting." Lucas barely reacted. His thoughts were already 10 steps ahead. He needed to talk to Emily, alone. Without another word, he stood up abruptly, adjusting his suit jacket. The sudden movement sent a ripple of attention toward their table, but Lucas didn't care. He was already striding across the restaurant, his laser-focused eyes locked onto Emily. She saw him coming. And she didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked ready. He reached her table in just a few long strides, his presence casting a heavy shadow over the pristine white tablecloth. The man beside Emily finally acknowledged him, his dark eyes flickering with mild curiosity but no real concern. Lucas ignored him entirely. "Emily," he said, his voice low but firm. She met his gaze, tilting her head slightly. "Lucas." A beat of silence stretched between them, tension crackling in the air like static electricity. The man beside her leaned back, sensing the undeniable gravity of the moment. Lucas inhaled sharply. "We need to talk." Emily didn't flinch. She simply picked up her wine glass, took a slow sip, and then placed it back down with deliberate care. "I figured you'd say that," she said smoothly. Then, finally, she turned to the man beside her. "Elliot, I'll be just a moment." Elliot. Lucas committed the name to memory, already filing it away under things he needed to investigate later. Emily stood gracefully, adjusting the strap of her dress, and gestured toward the dimly lit hallway leading to the restaurant's private terrace. Without waiting for his agreement, she turned and walked toward it. Lucas followed. The moment the door closed behind them, the outside air hit him, crisp, cool, a stark contrast to the heat boiling inside him. They stood on the terrace overlooking the glittering city, the skyline a blur of golden lights. Emily exhaled slowly, crossing her arms over her stomach, a small, instinctive protective gesture. "I assume you have questions." Lucas let out a bitter laugh, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Questions?" He shook his head. "Emily, are you serious right now? That's all you have to say?" She didn't react. She simply watched him, waiting. Lucas's control slipped. "How long have you known?" Her lips pressed together briefly. "Since the first test. 5 months ago." A sharp pang of betrayal sliced through him. 5 months? 5 whole months and she had said nothing? His fists clenched. "You weren't going to tell me at all, were you?" Emily's gaze didn't waver. "I hadn't decided yet." Lucas nearly saw red. "You hadn't decided?" His voice dropped lower, a dangerous edge creeping in. "Emily, that is my child. You don't get to just decide whether or not I get to know about my own kid." She finally looked away, her fingers tightening against her arms. For the first time, a flicker of something vulnerable crossed her expression. Lucas didn't back down. "Who the hell is Elliot?" he demanded. Emily let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Of course. That's what you care about?" He stepped closer. "You don't get to turn this around on me." "Who is he?" She met his gaze. "A friend." "That's not an answer." She exhaled. "Elliot is someone who has been there for me. Someone who has supported me through this pregnancy." Lucas's jaw tightened. "So he's the reason you didn't tell me?" Emily shook her head. "No. I didn't tell you because," she hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Because I didn't know if I wanted you involved." Lucas felt like she had physically punched him. He took a step back, his breathing uneven. "You really think that little of me?" Emily's eyes darkened. "You think this is about you? Lucas, you are a billionaire. You live in a world where everything is controlled, everything is calculated. You make decisions based on profit, not people. I wasn't going to bring a child into that world just because you think you have a right to it." Her words cut deep. Deeper than he wanted to admit. But he refused to let her rewrite history. "Don't act like I was the only one who prioritized ambition, Emily. You knew exactly what our life was when you married me." Her shoulders tensed. "Yes, I did. And that's why I left." Lucas let out a sharp breath. The past, the memories, the fights, it all felt like a raw wound suddenly ripped open. "So what, you just decided I wouldn't be a good father?" Emily swallowed hard. "I decided that I needed to figure out if you could be one before I told you." Silence fell between them. Lucas's heart pounded, his mind spinning in a million directions. He wasn't sure if he was angry, heartbroken, or just completely lost. Then, Emily spoke again, and her voice was softer now. "I gave you that DNA test because I wanted you to know. But what you do next, that's up to you." Lucas clenched his jaw. His instinct was to fight, to argue, to demand an explanation that made sense. But for the first time in his life, he had no control over what happened next. He looked at Emily, really looked at her. The woman he had once loved. The woman who had once believed in him. The mother of his child. And for the first time in years, Lucas Kane had no idea what to do. To be continued. Lucas Kane had always prided himself on control. Every business deal, every merger, every power move, calculated, precise, undeniable. He dictated the terms, set the rules. And yet, standing on that terrace, staring into Emily's unwavering eyes, he realized something terrifying. He had no control here. The knowledge burned in his chest like acid. His heart thundered in his ears, his breath came sharp, uneven. Emily had kept his child a secret for months, months that he would never get back. And now she had the audacity to look at him like he was the problem? Like she had been protecting their baby from him? He could barely process it. Emily was watching him carefully, waiting, as if measuring how much damage had already been done. The city lights bathed her face in a golden glow, but her expression was unreadable. For the first time, Lucas didn't know what she was thinking. And that unsettled him more than anything. A deep breath. He needed to steady himself. "So that's it?" he finally asked, his voice tight with restrained fury. "You tell me I have a child, then just leave it up to me whether I get to be involved?" Emily's lips parted slightly, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. It was gone as quickly as it came. "You deserve to know the truth," she said. "But whether you're ready for it, that's another question." Lucas let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Are you serious? You don't get to decide that for me." Her gaze didn't waver. "I already did." Something inside him snapped. "You should have told me the moment you found out, Emily." His voice was quieter now, but the weight behind it was unforgiving. You don't get to just disappear, then drop something like this on me months later and act like you're doing me a favor. Emily exhaled sharply, rubbing her temple. I didn't disappear. I left because I needed to, Lucas. You know why. His jaw clenched. And yet, here we are. A long silence stretched between them. A silence thick with resentment, regret, and something else. Something unspoken. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice quieter. If I had told you back then, what would you have done? Lucas blinked, thrown off by the question. She tilted her head, watching him. Really think about it. If I had told you, when I first found out I was pregnant, how would you have reacted? His instinct was to say something sharp, something absolute. But the moment the words formed in his mind, he faltered. Because he knew the answer. He would have tried to control it. Tried to control her. Tried to make it fit into his meticulously crafted life, into his empire, into his version of reality. And Emily knew it too. That realization hit him harder than anything else. She sighed, shaking her head. I wasn't going to let you treat this child like one of your business acquisitions, Lucas. His head snapped up. That's not fair. Isn't it? She asked, arching a brow. He wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he would have done the right thing, that he would have been there for her, for their baby. But something in her expression told him she had already considered every possible version of that outcome. And in every version, he had failed her. The thought made him sick. Emily shifted slightly, crossing her arms as if bracing herself. I don't want to fight, Lucas. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Then what do you want? She hesitated. I want to know if you're going to be in this child's life. His breath caught. The question shouldn't have shaken him. It should have been simple. Yes or no. A decision. But it wasn't simple. Not even close. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he was capable of being what this child needed. A flicker of something crossed Emily's face, disappointment. And that cut deeper than anything else. Before he could say anything, the terrace door swung open. Everything okay out here? Lucas turned sharply, his jaw tightening as Elliot stepped onto the terrace. The man's gaze flickered between them, assessing, but his posture remained calm. Too calm. Lucas felt an immediate and irrational hatred toward him. Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. Yeah, we're fine. Elliot's eyes lingered on her, searching, before shifting to Lucas. I think we both know that's not true. Lucas bristled. And you would know because. Elliot smiled, slow and deliberate. Because I've been there for Emily when you weren't. A sharp, electric silence followed. Lucas's vision blurred with fury. His fingers twitched at his sides, every instinct in his body telling him to wipe that smug expression off Elliot's face. Emily must have sensed it, because she stepped between them. Lucas, she warned, voice low. Elliot didn't move, didn't even flinch. He just kept watching Lucas, his expression unreadable but firm. You don't have to like me, he said finally. But you do need to accept that I'm in Emily's life. And until you decide what you're doing, I'm going to be in your child's life too. Lucas felt his pulse explode. He stepped forward instinctively, his shoulders tense, every fiber of his being rejecting that sentence. His child? In the hands of a stranger? A man who had nothing to do with this? No. Absolutely not. Emily placed a hand on his chest, stopping him. Lucas, stop. His breathing was heavy now, ragged. He looked down at Emily, at the way her eyes held silent pleading. And for the first time, he realized she was afraid of what he might do. That hit him like a gunshot to the chest. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to take a step back. His heart was raging inside his ribs, but he managed to exhale, to unclench his fists. He had never been a man who let emotions dictate his actions. And he wouldn't start now. His voice was low, controlled, when he finally spoke. "This isn't over." Emily searched his face for a moment, then nodded. "I know." Elliot, however, smirked slightly. "Take your time, Kane. But don't take too long." Lucas ignored him. Without another word, he turned and walked past them, back into the restaurant, back into the cold, ruthless world that made sense. But as he left, he knew one thing for certain. Whether Emily liked it or not, whether Elliot was in the picture or not, he was going to be in his child's life. And he was going to make damn sure that no one, not Emily, not Elliot, not anyone, stood in his way. To be continued. Lucas Kane stormed out of the restaurant, his mind a battlefield of emotions he couldn't afford to show. The cool night air hit him like a slap, but it did nothing to extinguish the fire raging inside. His child. His own flesh and blood. A secret kept from him, and now some other man was daring to act like he had a place in the picture. Elliot. The name alone made his teeth clench. Who the hell was he, and what had he done to earn Emily's trust? What had he given her that Lucas hadn't? He had to think. Had to act. But for the first time in his life, he didn't have a plan. Lucas ran a hand through his hair, pacing outside the restaurant, ignoring the curious stares of people passing by. He had built an empire, conquered boardrooms, crushed competitors. And yet, this woman, this one woman, had the power to dismantle him with a few simple words. "You have a child, Lucas." Damn it. He exhaled sharply and pulled out his phone. There was only one person he could talk to about this. Someone who wouldn't sugarcoat things. He dialed. 2 rings. Then a voice. "You only call this late when something's either gone to hell or you're about to make it worse," came the dry, knowing tone. "Good to hear from you too, Jackson," Lucas muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. Jackson Cole had been his closest friend since college, the one person who knew him beyond the headlines, beyond the billionaire persona. He was a criminal attorney, sharp as a blade, always 10 steps ahead in any fight. Lucas needed that kind of mind right now. "Talk to me," Jackson said, his voice shifting to something more serious. Lucas hesitated. Then, in a tight, controlled voice, he said, "I just found out I have a child." Silence. Then a low whistle. "Well, damn." Lucas clenched his jaw. "Yeah. You sure?" Lucas's grip on the phone tightened. "Emily told me herself." "Emily?" Jackson's tone sharpened. "As in the Emily?" "Yes." Another pause. Jackson had been there during the messy breakup, had seen the way Lucas drowned himself in work after she left. "Shit." Lucas let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah. My thoughts exactly." "What's she saying?" "She want money?" "A deal?" Lucas exhaled. "No. She doesn't want anything from me." That part stung more than he expected. Jackson was quiet for a beat. "Then what the hell does she want?" Lucas stared at the city skyline, feeling more lost than he ever had. "She wants to know if I'm going to be in the kid's life." "And?" Lucas closed his eyes. "I don't know." Jackson let out a sharp breath. "That's the first time I've ever heard you admit that." Lucas ignored the comment. "There's another problem." "Of course there is. She has someone else." Jackson cursed under his breath. "Who?" "Some guy named Elliot." Lucas spat the name like it was poison. "She says he's been there. That he's in her life." That he'll be in my kid's life if I'm not. Jackson was silent for a long moment. And you can't stand the thought of that, can you? Lucas didn't answer. He didn't have to. Jackson sighed. All right. What do you want to do about it? Lucas's jaw tightened. Find out everything about him. His job, his finances, his history. I want to know who the hell this man is and what he thinks he's doing in my family. You sure you want to go that route? Jackson asked carefully. I don't trust him, Lucas said coldly. And if he's a threat to my child, I need to know. Jackson was quiet for a moment, then said, I'll look into it. Lucas ended the call without another word. He stood there for a long time, staring at nothing, his mind moving a mile a minute. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. This wasn't about a failed relationship or old wounds. This was about his child. And no matter what it took, no matter what it cost, Lucas was going to make sure that child knew exactly who their father was. The next morning, Lucas was already in his office before the sun fully rose. His assistant, Claire, barely raised an eyebrow when he walked in. She was used to his impossible hours. Coffee, sir? She asked. Black, he muttered, already pulling up files on his screen. He barely noticed her placing the cup down before stepping away. His focus was singular, Elliot. It didn't take long before Jackson sent over a preliminary report. Elliot West. 34 years old. Runs a nonprofit for at-risk youth. No criminal record, no financial instability, no scandals. By all accounts, a decent man. Lucas frowned. It didn't sit right. There was always something. Always. Then he saw it. A single line in the report. Previously engaged. Fiancé died in an accident 3 years ago. Lucas leaned back, tapping his fingers against the desk. Tragedy. Loss. That's what Emily saw in him. She had always had a soft spot for people who had been hurt, who needed fixing. But was that all there was? His phone buzzed again. A message from Jackson. He's clean, Lucas. If you're looking for dirt, you won't find any. But I did find something else. Thought you'd want to see it in person. Lucas's brow furrowed. In person? Jackson sent an address. Lucas didn't hesitate. Within the hour, he was pulling up to a modest but well-maintained community center. He stepped inside, instantly noticing the laughter of children, the quiet hum of activity. Then he saw him. Elliot. The man was surrounded by kids, kneeling to their level, listening intently as they talked. He smiled warmly, his entire presence exuding patience, kindness. Lucas felt something dark coil inside him. Emily had chosen this life? A man who worked in places like this, who didn't own a private jet, who wasn't commanding boardrooms? He was nothing like Lucas. And yet, he was in his child's life. Lucas turned on his heel and walked out, his mind made up. This wasn't just about proving himself. It was about making sure that when his child looked up at him one day, they saw a father worth believing in. And Lucas Kane never lost. Not in business. Not in war. And definitely not when it came to his own blood. To be continued. Lucas Kane had never felt the weight of uncertainty before. His entire life had been built on control, precision, and execution. He calculated every risk, anticipated every move before it happened, and crushed every obstacle in his path. But now, standing at the edge of something he couldn't fully grasp, he realized he was in unfamiliar territory. He had spent the entire night thinking, planning, strategizing. His instincts told him that Elliot wasn't a threat, not in the conventional sense. The man was clean, respected, and by all accounts, deeply involved in the lives of the people he helped. But that wasn't enough for Lucas. He wasn't just looking for a weakness, he was looking for his place in all of this. The bitter truth was, Emily had moved on. She had built a life without him. And now, she was asking him whether he wanted to be a part of something that already existed, something that didn't seem to need him. But Lucas didn't know how to be needed. He only knew how to take. He arrived at Emily's house unannounced the next morning. It was a small home, nothing extravagant, but it had warmth. Lucas could see signs of a life lived with care, the well-tended garden, the neat porch, the toys scattered near the steps. He hesitated for a second, then knocked. The door opened, and Emily stood there, a mixture of surprise and caution in her eyes. Lucas. Morning. She exhaled softly, then stepped aside, allowing him in. He noticed how different she looked from the woman he had once known. There was something settled about her now, like she had finally found the peace that had always eluded her when they were together. He followed her to the kitchen, where a small breakfast had already been set up. "Did you eat?" she asked, her voice neutral. No. She didn't offer, and he didn't ask. Instead, he got straight to the point. "I want to be in my child's life." Emily stilled for a moment before turning to face him. "Are you sure?" Lucas bristled at the question. "Of course I'm sure." She folded her arms. "Lucas, this isn't a deal. You don't get to just sign a contract and walk away if things don't go your way. I know that." "Do you?" she pressed, her gaze unwavering. "Because I need you to understand something, this child is not a business venture. They don't need a CEO. They need a father." Lucas clenched his jaw. "And you think Elliot is that father?" Emily sighed. "Elliot is someone who has been here. He didn't have to be, but he was. He shows up, Lucas. He always shows up." The words stung more than they should have. Lucas looked away, his hands tightening into fists. "I can show up." Emily studied him for a long moment. Then she walked to the counter, picking up something small. She returned and handed it to him. It was a picture. A sonogram. His breath hitched. "This is your child," she said softly. "Not an investment. Not a competition. Not a way to prove something to yourself. If you're in, you're all in. No conditions. No control. Just love." Lucas stared at the image, something foreign twisting in his chest. For the first time in his life, he had no strategy for what came next. The sound of a door opening behind them made them both turn. Elliot stood there, his face unreadable. Lucas's grip on the sonogram tightened. This was far from over. Lucas stood frozen, gripping the sonogram so tightly his knuckles turned white. Across the room, Elliot held his ground, his face unreadable but his posture firm. The air was thick with tension, an unspoken battle of wills unfolding between the two men. Emily, standing between them, let out a quiet sigh and turned to Elliot. "Hey," she said softly, as if trying to defuse the storm before it began. Elliot's gaze flickered from Lucas to Emily before he stepped forward, placing a set of keys on the table. "I was just dropping these off. I didn't mean to interrupt." Lucas narrowed his eyes. He knew what this was. Elliot was offering him an exit, a chance to retreat. But Lucas Kane didn't retreat. Not in business, not in life, and certainly not when it came to something this important. "I'm staying," Lucas said firmly, his voice edged with something even he didn't fully understand. Emily looked at him with a mixture of surprise and something else, hope, maybe, but also doubt. Elliot's face remained impassive, but there was something in his eyes, a silent calculation, as if he was trying to decide what kind of man Lucas really was. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unyielding, until finally, Elliot spoke. "Then stay," he said simply. Lucas expected more, some sort of challenge, an argument, a reason for Elliot to assert his position in Emily's life. But there was none. Just 2 words, spoken without malice or hesitation. Emily turned back to Lucas, her expression softer now. "Are you sure?" Lucas exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to be a father," he admitted, the words foreign on his tongue. "I don't know how to do any of this." Emily's eyes softened. "No one does, not at first." For a man who had spent his entire life preparing, strategizing, and executing plans with absolute precision, the idea of walking into something blind terrified him. But as he looked at Emily, at the small house that already felt more like a home than his penthouse ever did, at the sonogram still clutched in his hand, he realized something. This wasn't about control. It wasn't about winning. It was about showing up. "All right," he said finally. "Then I'm in." Elliot nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of something Lucas couldn't quite place. Without another word, he turned and left, leaving Lucas alone with Emily. For the first time in a long time, Lucas felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It wasn't victory. It was purpose.